It began on a storm-soaked road in Newport in the summer of 1893, when a governess seeking shelter crossed the gates of a mansion where no laughter had been heard in years. Inside, a reclusive tycoon haunted by loss opened his door, and unknowingly, his heart. That night, beneath the thunder and candlelight, two lives from opposite worlds collided, challenging every rule, every boundary, and every whisper of society. Was it fate or folly, love or ruin? You're about to discover the truth hidden beneath the stormlight. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe that love can defy class, fear, and time itself? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1893. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and rose gardens through the wide marble colonnades of the Langston summer estate. It was a grand mansion on Bellevue Avenue, adorned with wrought iron balconies and a cascade of climbing ivy that curled lovingly around its stone facade. Inside, beneath frescoed ceilings and velvet drapes imported from France, the echoes of the elite drifted through the halls, ladies in satin whispering over calling cards, gentlemen discussing fortunes between brandy and cigars. Yet among them moved a figure in quiet contrast, Miss Kate Ellsworth. She walked with poise and purpose, a governess in her 28th year, her bearing dignified despite her modest place in the world. Her gowns were simple but well kept, muted grey tones with high collars and mother-of-pearl buttons, always pressed, always appropriate. Her chestnut hair, neatly pinned at the nape, framed a face both delicate and strong, and her hazel eyes, though serene, carried the weight of a woman who had long learned to observe more than she spoke. Kate had arrived 2 weeks prior, brought from Boston to care for Clara Langston, the bright and spirited 7-year-old daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Everett Langston, pillars of New York society. The child had taken quickly to her, wrapping herself around Kate's arm during morning walks and whispering secrets into her sleeve as if the governess were her most trusted confidant. Kate, for her part, had not expected affection in this new post. She had expected duty, silence, and perhaps another season of being invisible beneath chandeliers and judgments. Clara, unknowingly, had given her something far gentler: presence. The days passed in a ritual of lessons, embroidery, and walks along the cliffside promenade where the Atlantic crashed against the rocks below like the unspoken desires of a world too proper to name them aloud. Kate did not frequent the grand salons or garden parties held by the ladies of Newport. Her place was beside Clara, beneath the parasol, not among the socialites who glanced past her as though she were part of the furniture. And yet she observed everything: the nervous laughter of debutantes, the stiff smiles of arranged engagements, and the name most often spoken in hushed tones: Henry Caldwell, the Tycoon, the recluse. His estate stood half a mile from the Langstons, a mansion of dark stone and shuttered windows, perched high like a watchful sentinel over the Atlantic. No guests entered, no laughter spilled from its doors. Rumor said he had once been the toast of Pittsburgh, brilliant, powerful, and devastatingly handsome. Rumor also said he had buried his wife and child after a fire and had not truly spoken to anyone since. Kate heard the whispers from the parlour maids and the laundresses. Some called him mad. Others claimed he roamed his gardens in the moonlight, speaking to ghosts. But to Kate, who had long ceased to believe in idle talk, he was merely a name wrapped in sorrow, and sorrow she understood. One morning Mrs. Langston departed suddenly for New York, citing an urgent matter with her sister's confinement. Mr. Langston followed within the hour. Clara, delighted at being left in Kate's care for the week, begged for an outing beyond the usual garden paths. The sun had emerged with deceptive charm, casting a golden sheen across the lawns. Yet Kate, always observant, had noted the heaviness in the air, the scent of rain on the horizon, the birds flying low. Still, she agreed to a brief carriage ride before the afternoon lessons. By 2 o'clock, the coach was readied. Clara wore a white muslin dress with a blue sash, her golden curls tucked beneath a straw bonnet, and Kate, dressed in her travelling grey with gloves and a simple hat, settled beside her as the horses began to trot down the path leading toward the sea cliffs. The clouds gathered faster than expected. What began as a breeze turned sharp, and within minutes the skies darkened with foreboding purpose. The first drops fell near the gates of the Caldwell estate, thick, cold, and insistent. The coachman glanced back, his concern clear. "Miss Ellsworth, I fear we won't make it to town before the worst hits." Kate's voice was calm. "We should turn back, or seek shelter, if need be." And then the storm broke. It came not as a drizzle, but as a curtain of rain, sweeping sideways with howling wind. Thunder cracked like a warning from heaven itself, and the horses, startled, reared in panic. Clara screamed as the carriage jostled and skidded across the muddy road. The wheels caught on a rut, and the entire vehicle lurched to one side before settling, tilted and stuck. The coachman fought to calm the horses, already drenched, while Kate pulled Clara close, wrapping her cloak around the child's trembling body. There was no time to turn back. The Langston estate was too far, the rain too fierce, and then Kate looked up. Through the veil of water and mist she saw it, the iron gates of the Caldwell mansion looming just ahead, half-shrouded in vines and shadow. She hesitated. Every whisper returned to her. Warnings, stories, tragedies. But Clara was shivering, the rain seeping through her shoes, and the road was no longer passable. Kate squared her shoulders. "We will knock," she said firmly. "There is no other choice." And with Clara in her arms, her skirts heavy with water and heart-pounding beneath her high-collared bodice, Kate Ellsworth stepped through the gates of a place no one entered, and toward a night that would change the course of everything she believed about duty, silence, and the hidden corners of the human heart. The iron gates groaned open with reluctant dignity, their rusted hinges straining beneath years of disuse. Rain lashed at Kate Ellsworth's cheeks as she crossed the threshold. Clara held tightly against her chest. The child's shivering had worsened, her small hands clutching Kate's collar with trembling fingers. The gravel path that led to the mansion was slick with mud, and the horses behind them whinnied, stamping against the storm's fury. The driver, soaked to the bone, approached hesitantly, tipping his cap. "If I may, miss, I'll wait with the carriage once you're inside." "The wheels will be stuck fast for some time." Kate nodded, her voice steady despite the cold and fear tightening in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick. Keep the horses calm." They ascended the stone steps of the Caldwell estate, massive, cold and imposing in the grey afternoon light. The rain darkened the limestone facade, making it seem almost mournful. Ivy curled around the carved columns like time's fingers clutching the past, and tall windows reflected nothing but the rage of the storm outside. Kate raised her hand and knocked. For a long moment, there was only the sound of water rushing from the overhangs and thunder grumbling in the distance. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, approached from within. The door creaked open. A man stood before them, tall, severe. His presence filled the doorway with an air of restrained power. His face was sharply defined, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, and his eyes, grey-blue like the sea before a tempest, rested on Kate, then dropped to Clara. He said nothing. Kate's voice, though soft, held the firmness of someone who had learned to mask urgency with control. "Our carriage was forced off the road," she explained, "and the child is chilled. We ask only for shelter until the worst has passed." The man's gaze flicked to the rain-soaked path behind her, then returned to her eyes. There was something guarded in his expression, as though her presence scraped against a wound he kept hidden from the world. "You are with the Langstons," he said at last. Not a question, but a recognition. "I am Miss Ellsworth, governess to Miss Clara Langston." Clara, sensing something unspoken in the exchange, burrowed deeper into Kate's arms. The man's jaw tightened. He hesitated only a heartbeat longer before stepping aside. "Come in." They crossed the threshold, and the great door shut behind them with a final thud, sealing out the storm. and perhaps the rest of the world. The entrance hall was vast and dim, lit only by the flicker of gaslight sconces and the grey of the rain filtering through tall windows. Marble floors stretched outward in cold elegance, and a grand staircase curved upward like a frozen wave. The silence inside the house was oppressive, as though time had stopped within these walls. The man took Clara's wet cloak with careful detachment and handed it to a maid who had appeared silently from an adjacent hallway. She, too, seemed startled by the presence of visitors, her eyes wide, her movements hesitant. "Warm blankets, tea," the man instructed without raising his voice, "and send word to the kitchen." Kate's eyes followed him as he turned toward the drawing room, his gait precise, his back as straight as a soldier's. She removed her gloves slowly, as if unsure whether she was truly allowed to settle into the space. "This way," he said, holding open the tall door to a room where the scent of old wood, smoke, and something more elusive, loss, perhaps, hung in the air. The drawing room was expansive, its walls panelled in walnut and lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling. Heavy velvet drapes framed the rain-streaked windows, and a fire had been lit recently, its warmth still struggling to chase the chill from the air. Over the fireplace hung a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a delicate mouth, her image faded but haunting. Clara was taken by the maid to change into dry clothes, leaving Kate alone with the man whose silence carried more weight than most men's words. He stood near the hearth, watching the flames with his hands clasped behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and restrained. "You must think me ungracious. I do not keep company." Kate stepped forward, her damp skirt brushing lightly against the polished floor. "I assure you, Mr. Caldwell, I do not intrude by choice, but necessity makes strange visitors." The name lingered in the air between them. Mr. Henry Caldwell, the tycoon whose fortune had built railroads, whose grief had built walls even thicker. He turned to face her. In the shifting light of the fire, his features softened, though his eyes remained unreadable. Most would have continued on, even in the storm. Most would not have risked the life of a child, she replied, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. The corner of his mouth moved, an expression not quite a smile, not quite bitterness. A long silence followed. Neither of them looked away. Then, gently, he gestured toward a tufted chair near the fireplace. "Please, warm yourself." Kate sat, her back straight, her hands folded over her lap. Her wet skirts clung uncomfortably to her legs, but she betrayed no sign of discomfort. Henry poured a cup of tea from a silver set and offered it to her. Their fingers touched for a moment as she accepted the cup. Just that. Flesh, brushing flesh. And yet it left behind a charge neither acknowledged aloud. "I've not seen you at any of the summer affairs," he said at last. "I was not invited," she answered simply. Another pause. His eyes searched her face, and though he said nothing more, Kate could feel the subtle shift in his presence. Less guarded now, less stone. It was as though something in her tone, her stillness, had disarmed the defenses he wore like a second skin. "I was told," she added softly, "that you do not receive guests." "I do not," he confirmed, his gaze drifting toward the portrait above the fire. This house was never meant to be shared again. Kate followed his glance and understood. She did not ask. She did not need to. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, her voice low and sincere. Henry blinked slowly, his throat tightening, though he remained composed. It was a long time ago. Still, some echoes do not fade. Kate looked into the fire, letting the silence speak for both of them. The warmth crept into her fingers, into her bones. Outside, the storm pounded on the windows, but inside, a quiet deeper than solitude filled the room. There was something strangely intimate in their silence. Two lives that had never crossed, now briefly intertwined by rain, by chance, by grief, they did not name. Clara returned in dry clothes, her cheeks rosy once more. She ran to Kate and nestled beside her on the chair. Henry watched them with a gaze that lingered, not on the child, but on the woman who held her. When it was time to leave, the rain had not stopped, but it had softened to a mist. Henry walked them to the door himself. Before opening it, he looked at Kate, not just with politeness, but with something more searching. "I trust the roads will be passable soon," he said. Kate nodded. "We are grateful for your kindness." He inclined his head. It was not kindness. It was necessary. Their eyes locked for a moment longer, and then the door opened, the world rushed in, and the silence they had shared was carried away with the wind. Kate stepped out into the wet afternoon with Clara's hand in hers, her heart strangely unsteady. She did not look back, but she knew he did. The rain did not end that night. It deepened into something heavier, steadier, an endless rhythm against the tall windows that seemed to echo every silence within the Caldwell mansion. The house itself appeared to breathe differently once the sun sank, and the last of the servants retreated, their footsteps fading into the distance like memories descending into sleep. Kate sat near the hearth, a shawl drawn lightly over her shoulders, her wet skirts now drying by the fire's slow warmth. Little Clara rested on the chaise beside her, half covered with a quilt the housemaid had brought earlier. The child's breathing was steady, her lashes trembling with the dreams of the innocent. Henry Caldwell stood at a distance, one hand resting on the marble mantel, the firelight painting lines of amber and shadow across his features. His dark coat had been removed, revealing a crisp white shirt and waistcoat, the collar slightly open. He looked every bit the image of authority and solitude, yet something in his stillness betrayed unrest. For a long while, neither spoke. Only the crackle of fire and the steady pulse of rain filled the space between them. The air felt suspended, fragile, as though the smallest word could break the invisible thread that held them in that fragile equilibrium. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice quiet but clear, as though he feared the house might listen. "It has been many years since this room has seen company." Kate lifted her eyes from the fire, her tone measured. "Then perhaps the silence has grown too used to itself." A faint, ironic curve touched his mouth. "You speak as though silence were alive." "Perhaps it is," she replied softly. "In some homes, silence becomes a companion." He studied her for a moment longer, intrigued by the simplicity of her words. She did not fill the space with nervous chatter, as so many others would have done. There was calmness in her, an order that seemed born not of ease, but of endurance. Henry moved to the window and looked out at the rain. His reflection merged with the glass, the firelight flickering behind him like an echo of life he no longer claimed. "There was a time," he said slowly, "when this house was filled with music. Every evening the windows were open and the sound of the piano carried into the gardens. My wife played, sometimes until dawn." Kate did not answer at once. The confession came so unexpectedly that it seemed almost sacred. She only turned her gaze toward the piano in the corner of the room, its lid closed, its surface coated with a thin veil of dust. "She played beautifully?" Kate asked, her voice gentle. "She played with joy," he corrected. "There is a difference." His eyes lingered on the instrument before turning back toward the flames. "After the fire, I could not bear to hear a single note again. It felt as though the world expected me to mourn publicly, to toast her memory with fine wine and carry on as though grief could be swallowed. But grief," his voice faltered. The word caught between his breath and the shadows. "Grief does not behave. It lingers. It intrudes." Kate's hands tightened around the shawl in her lap. Her own memories stirred like embers beneath ash. "You need not explain it to me," she murmured. He glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You speak as one who understands." She hesitated, the line between propriety and truth blurring under the warmth of the fire. "I lost my parents 5 years ago. Fever. It swept through our town so quickly that I barely remember the days between their first cough and their last breath. She paused, her tone steady but threaded with something deeper. After that, the house was empty. I had to sell it to pay their debts. There was no music left either. For a moment, neither of them looked away. In her eyes, Henry saw not pity, but understanding, the rare kind that does not demand comfort, only presence. The fire cracked softly, as if agreeing with the silence. Henry crossed the room, his step slow, deliberate, the faint creak of the wooden floor accompanying each movement. When he stopped near her chair, the warmth of the fire mingled with the nearness of him. "I apologize," he said quietly. "I did not mean to make you recall what you have tried to forget." "I have not forgotten," Kate answered, her tone almost whispering. "Some things refuse to be forgotten, no matter how far we walk from them." Their eyes met again, and for a fleeting instant, time seemed suspended. There was no servant, no thunder, no storm, only the unspoken recognition between two souls marked by loss and by endurance. Outside, lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the rain-slicked glass and the pale faces of portraits hanging in the hallway. Among them, the portrait of Henry's late wife gazed down, her painted smile faded by time. Kate followed his glance, sensing the weight of that unseen presence. "She must have been kind," she said softly. Henry's reply came after a pause. "She was light itself, the kind that made people believe they were better merely by standing near her." Kate lowered her gaze. "And yet even light can be fragile." He looked at her again, and in that single glance, something raw flickered behind his composure. "You speak like someone who has known too much night." "I have," she admitted, "but I have learned to walk in it." There was no need for further explanation. The distance between them had changed, subtle, imperceptible, yet undeniably closer. The maid returned briefly to stoke the fire and ensure the child was settled. She cast a quick, uncertain look at Henry, as though unaccustomed to seeing her master linger in conversation. When she left, the room grew quiet once more, the only light now from the candles and the glow of the hearth. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something indistinct. Kate rose to adjust the quilt over her shoulders, her movements tender, instinctive. Henry watched as she brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face, a simple gesture that carried a grace he had not seen in years. "Children are fortunate to have you," he said at last. Kate turned, surprised. "You cannot know that." "I can see it," he replied, his voice low, almost reluctant. "You have patience in your hands, the kind that cannot be taught." Her breath caught slightly, though she managed a composed smile. "Patience is born of necessity." He seemed to consider that, his eyes softening. Then, with a faint sigh, he took a seat across from her, the firelight casting his face into sculpted planes of gold and shadow. They spoke quietly, of small things at first, the unpredictability of Rhode Island weather, the books she favored when teaching Clara, the absurdity of certain Newport traditions. Each word between them seemed to weave a delicate thread, fragile yet real. At one point, Kate asked, "Do you ever miss company?" Henry looked toward the fire, his expression unreadable. "I miss peace," he said. "Company rarely brings it." "And yet," she answered softly, "there are moments when silence shared is not loneliness." The words hung there, like a confession. Henry met her gaze, and for a long moment neither dared to breathe. The firelight reflected in his eyes, making them appear both luminous and distant. He wanted to say something, perhaps to thank her, perhaps to deny her, but instead he looked away, exhaling slowly. The night deepened, the candles burned lower. Outside, the storm softened to a steady drizzle. Time seemed to slow, stretching between them like the quiet after a prayer. Kate rested her hand on the armrest, unaware that Henry's gaze had returned to her face. There was no vanity in her beauty. It was something quieter, made of integrity and composure. Her presence filled the room not by design, but by essence. When the clock struck midnight, Clara slept soundly, and the fire had burned to embers. Henry rose, walking to the mantel to stir the coals. The soft crackle of firelight returned, bathing them in amber once more. "You should rest," he said, his voice gentler now. "The storm will pass by dawn." Kate stood, careful not to wake the child. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Caldwell." He turned toward her, his eyes lingering longer than courtesy allowed. "Kindness," he murmured, almost to himself. "That is not what this is." Her breath caught, though she did not move. His tone carried a gravity she could not name, something between warning and confession. Yet before she could respond, he inclined his head slightly, regaining the composure that shielded him. "Good night, Miss Ellsworth." Kate lowered her gaze, her heart unsettled. "Good night." As she led Clara upstairs to the room they had been given, she paused once at the doorway, glancing back toward the drawing room. Henry stood where she had left him, silhouetted by the glow of the fire, his hand resting on the piano lid. She did not see him close his eyes, nor hear the soft whisper that escaped his lips, a name he had not spoken in years. By dawn, the storm had ceased. The first light of morning spilled through the windows, glinting off the damp gardens and the pale marble of the veranda. Kate awoke before Clara and dressed in silence. Her heart felt both heavy and curiously light, as though the night had left a trace upon her that could not be brushed away. When she descended the staircase, the house seemed different. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt aware. Henry did not appear as she and Clara stepped out into the cool morning air, but as the carriage pulled away, Kate thought she glimpsed movement behind one of the upper windows. A figure standing still, watching, his face half hidden by shadow. She told herself it was nothing, just imagination born of fatigue. Yet the memory of candlelight and the quiet of that night would follow her long after the rain had dried. The late summer sun returned to Newport with a deceptive serenity, casting warm light over marble facades and trimmed boxwood hedges, as though storms had never passed through its winding avenues. Life on Bellevue Avenue resumed its glittering rhythm, carriages parading down cobblestone lanes, ladies gossiping beneath lace parasols, and gentlemen tipping their hats with practiced elegance. But beneath that polished surface, the social season spun its intricate web of gazes, murmurs, and expectations. Inside the Langston residence, Kate Ellsworth resumed her duties with the same measured grace as before. Clara's lessons continued each morning, followed by afternoon walks and quiet readings beneath the pergola. To the eyes of the household, nothing had changed. But within Kate, something trembled. Something she could neither name nor dismiss. The rain-soaked night at Caldwell House lingered in her memory like the scent of smoke in fabric. She had returned to her world, yes, but it no longer fit as neatly around her. It was on the 5th day after the storm that the unexpected occurred. The butler entered the schoolroom with composed gravity, a white calling card resting on the small silver tray he carried. He approached Kate with the delicacy of one delivering news too peculiar to explain. "Miss Ellsworth, you have a caller," he announced. She looked up from Clara's copybook, her brows knitting slightly. "A caller? For me?" He cleared his throat. "He requested an audience with Miss Clara, but he asked for you first." Kate rose, smoothing her skirts with practiced elegance. "Who is it?" "Mr. Henry Caldwell," he said, the name almost inaudible in the quiet room. Clara's eyes lit up with innocent joy. "Mr. Caldwell. He's here?" Kate's heartbeat quickened. She took a steadying breath before replying, "Let him in. We'll receive him in the morning parlor." Moments later, she stood by the tall windows of the parlor, her back perfectly straight, her gloves adjusted. Her mind raced with unspoken questions. Why had he come? What purpose could justify such a visit? And then the door opened. Henry entered with the ease of a man who had once commanded entire boardrooms, but his gaze searched only for one person. He carried a small parcel in his gloved hand, wrapped in brown paper and tied with blue ribbon. "Miss Ellsworth," he said with a faint inclination of the head, "forgive the intrusion." She met his gaze calmly. "You are not unwelcome, Mr. Caldwell. though I must confess, your visit is unexpected. I come under the humble pretense, he said, holding out the parcel, of returning Miss Clara's shawl. It was left behind in the drawing room. Kate accepted the parcel without looking down. How kind of you. He hesitated for a moment, then added, and to ask if I might speak with Miss Clara for a few moments, with your permission. At that, Clara entered, dressed in white with a blue ribbon, her curls bouncing with excitement. Mr. Caldwell, she exclaimed, running to him without a trace of decorum. Henry bent down slightly to greet her, his expression softening in a way that few had ever seen. Miss Clara, he said with a small smile, I trust your lessons have continued with the same diligence. They have, and we're reading The Secret Garden now. Miss Kate makes the voices. Henry glanced toward Kate, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Does she? I should have guessed. They moved to the settee, Clara chatting animatedly while Henry listened with quiet attentiveness. Kate watched them from a modest distance, never sitting, her posture composed, though something restless stirred in her chest. The servants, though silent, passed by the doorway more often than usual, their eyes discreetly taking measure of the scene. After some minutes, Clara turned suddenly toward her governess. May I invite Mr. Caldwell to my birthday tea next week? Please, Miss Kate? Kate hesitated. It may not be proper, darling. But Clara turned back to Henry, her voice eager. Would you come? It will be in the garden, and there'll be cake with violets. Henry looked toward Kate as though asking her rather than the child. If I were invited, would it cause displeasure? Kate's reply was measured, her voice steady despite the undertow she felt within. It is not for me to say, but I would not wish Clara to be disappointed. He nodded slowly, and to Clara he said, Then I shall attend, if only for the violets. The child clapped with delight. But Kate's gaze met his, and in that glance there was no delight, only a question that trembled just beneath the surface. Why are you really here? After some more conversation, Henry rose to leave. Clara embraced him without hesitation, and then skipped out of the room with the maid. Kate followed him to the front vestibule, where the silence stretched between them like an invisible veil. You did not come only to return a shawl, she said at last. No, he admitted, his voice low. I came because, he paused, because the silence in my house has felt louder since you left. She looked away, her breath catching. That silence belongs to your past, Mr. Caldwell. I would not presume to interfere. His gaze held hers, searching. And yet, Miss Ellsworth, there are some silences that only certain voices can soothe. The sound of footsteps interrupted them. Mr. Langston's cousin, Miss Winifred, descending the stairs with the alertness of a hawk sensing scandal. Her gaze flicked quickly from Kate to Henry and back again. Ah, Mr. Caldwell, she said with a practiced smile. A pleasure. We do not often see you on this side of the avenue. Henry bowed with reserved civility. Only a brief visit, Miss Winifred. I shall take my leave. He turned once more toward Kate. Until next week. She inclined her head. Good day, Mr. Caldwell. When the door closed behind him, the silence that remained was nothing like the one in his house. This one hummed with danger. Miss Winifred's smile turned thin. He has never visited this home, not even when Mrs. Langston held her garden soirées. Kate said nothing. You must be very persuasive, Miss Ellsworth. I have never tried to be, she replied evenly. Miss Winifred tilted her head. No, but influence comes in many forms. The household must be careful. Reputation is a delicate thing. And then she was gone, her meaning left dangling like perfume in the air. Later that evening, Kate stood by her bedroom window, the shawl still folded on the table beside her. Her thoughts drifted like the breeze through the curtain. She should have been more careful. She should have drawn the line before it blurred. But as she closed her eyes, the only thing she saw was the way Henry had looked at her when he said the silence had grown louder, and the ache that moved through her then was not fear. It was longing, silenced, contained, but no longer invisible. The sun shone with theatrical brilliance over Bellevue Avenue that Saturday morning, as if determined to outdo the chandeliers that hung in the parlours of Newport's grandest homes. The garden at the Winthrop estate had been transformed into a small court of society, a display of linen parasols, silken gowns in pastel hues, and meticulously groomed hedges that lined the walkways like obedient sentinels. Everywhere there was perfume and laughter, and the sound of violins drifting over the trimmed lawn like something from a dream. Kate Ellsworth stood at the edge of the gathering, her gloved hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on Clara, who chased butterflies with other children on the southern side of the garden. Though she had been invited solely as the governess, not as a guest, the host, an old acquaintance of Mrs. Langston, had insisted she attend. "For the child's sake," she'd said, with a smile that concealed calculation. Kate wore a modest gown of soft lavender muslin, high-necked and unadorned, a dress suitable for her station. Her straw bonnet shaded her face, and her figure, though elegant in its simplicity, stood in stark contrast to the elaborately feathered ladies who fanned themselves beside fountains and sipped chilled lemonade, as though they were in Paris rather than Rhode Island. She was aware of the glances, the fleeting turns of heads, the polite nods that never reached the eyes. She had long learned to absorb them in silence. Then the air shifted. The low murmur of conversation dipped for a moment, like the hush before an aria. Kate felt it before she turned. There, just beyond the topiary arch, stood Henry Caldwell. He was not dressed in formal morning attire. He wore a tailored frock coat of deep charcoal, with gloves tucked under one arm, and a silk cravat that lent him an air of refined indifference. His presence did not shout. It whispered power. Not the kind bought with gold, but the kind forged in loss and solitude. The guests took notice. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-flight. It was said Henry Caldwell never attended public affairs. His absence had become legend. And yet there he was, walking into a garden of idle nobility with the quiet assurance of a man who owed explanation to no one. Kate's breath caught. He greeted the host with a nod, said a few words to an elderly lady of status, and then, without hesitation, crossed the garden directly toward Kate. The murmurs resumed, faster now, like wind through tall grass. He stopped before her, bowing his head slightly. "Miss Ellsworth." She lowered her gaze, her heart drumming an anxious rhythm beneath her bodice. "Mr. Caldwell, I had not thought I would find such solace in a garden party," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. She lifted her eyes to meet his. "You knew I would be here." He did not deny it. Clara mentioned it. Kate's fingers tightened subtly around the handle of her parasol. "This is not a place for solitude, Mr. Caldwell. It's a place for spectacle." His gaze lingered. "Then let us be still, even in the midst of it." From across the lawn, several matrons observed them intently, their expressions shifting between curiosity and disapproval. A particularly sharp glance came from a woman with emerald feathers in her hat, Lady Penelope Astor, known for her tongue as much as her titles. Kate stepped back. "We are being watched." "Let them watch," he said quietly. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice broke on the restraint. "Please." Something passed between them then, not defiance, not surrender, but a suspended truth neither dared yet name. Henry inclined his head once more. "Then I shall leave you to your duties." But before he turned, Clara appeared at his side, her cheeks flushed and her hands covered in grass. "You came." Henry knelt slightly, smiling. "As promised. You must stay for the lemonade. Miss Kate, may he?" Kate glanced around. The stares were multiplying. "Clara, just for a little while," the child pleaded. Henry looked to Kate once more. "Miss Ellsworth?" She closed her eyes briefly, gathering the last of her composure. "As you wish." He stayed. They did not speak again, not directly. But he remained near Clara, and through every glance, every pause, every shared breath across distance, a conversation without words unfolded. The rival governess, Miss Thornbridge observed it all with a sharp, calculating expression. She had long set her sights on a connection that might lift her out of her current station. Seeing Kate, gentle, plain, unobtrusive, command the attention of a man such as Henry Caldwell ignited something bitter in her chest. That evening, when the guests had gone and the garden was once again only flowers and silence, Miss Thornbridge found herself in the servants' hall, offering casual remarks with carefully chosen words. "She is just a governess after all," she said. "But we all know how ambition hides behind innocence these days." The next morning, Kate found a parcel on the small table in the corridor outside the schoolroom. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with deep blue ribbon. No note, no sender. Inside, a book, slim, bound in green leather, Poems of Night and Sea by Helen Hunt Jackson. She opened the cover. In fine, deliberate handwriting, one line. "Some silences are too loud to ignore. H.C." Her breath caught. She closed the book gently, as though it might shatter. That afternoon, Miss Winifred Langston requested her presence in the east parlour. Kate entered with careful steps. Winifred sat by the window, embroidery in hand, but her needle rested, unmoving. "I have always admired your discretion, Miss Ellsworth," she began, "and I know your position requires a delicate balance." Kate did not speak. "It would be unwise," Winifred continued, "to place oneself in the path of suspicion, particularly when it comes to unattached gentlemen." Kate's voice was calm. "I have done nothing to invite suspicion. Perception is often louder than truth," Winifred replied, her tone crisp, "and Bellevue Avenue thrives on perception." The warning hung in the air, cloaked in civility, but sharp as glass. That night, Kate sat at her writing desk. The book remained unopened beside her. She considered writing a note, a thank you, a refusal, a warning. But in the end, she did nothing. Not because she lacked the words, but because the ones she truly longed to say were the only ones she could never send. And so, in the silence of her room, she pressed her hand to the cover of the book and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the garden, rustling petals and leaves, whispering truths that had no voice but longing. The house was unusually quiet that afternoon, as if the very air within its walls had paused to listen. Outside, the wind stirred the tall hydrangeas in the garden, their blossoms trembling like hearts too long hidden. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of distant thunder. In her chamber, on the upper floor of the Langston residence, Kate Ellsworth sat at her small desk, a sheet of ivory paper before her, the ink on her pen still wet from hesitation. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, not from weakness, but from the weight of what she dared to put into words. She had not intended to write to him. She had told herself that silence was wiser, safer, and yet, since the moment she had found his gift, the green leather book resting quietly on the table outside the schoolroom, she had not known a single moment of peace. Now the words spilled in ink, slow and deliberate. "Mr. Caldwell." She paused, the title already too distant, too cold. She stared at the line, the name, the man it belonged to, the man whose voice lingered in her memory, longer than she cared to admit, whose gaze had unstitched the seams of her carefully kept composure. She began again, this time without formality. "Henry, you should not have sent the book, and yet I cannot seem to stop opening it, as though the pages might explain what neither of us dares to say aloud. I read your inscription more times than I ought to confess, and every time I close the cover, I tell myself this must end. That silence must remain unbroken. That dignity must outweigh desire. But dignity," she continued, "is a cruel companion in the face of affection." She sat back for a moment, her heart pounding. The words on the page were too much, and yet not enough. How could she explain the contradiction that lived inside her, this constant ache between reason and longing? How could she tell him that she dreamt of him, and then scolded herself for it before dawn? "I do not belong in your world," she wrote slowly. And you, perhaps, no longer wish to belong in mine. And yet here we are, two people caught in a space neither of us can name. I fear what others will say. I fear what I will say. But most of all, I fear the silence growing between us." She stared at the final sentence, its truth too loud. Before she could stop herself, she folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and set it atop the green leather book on her desk. But she did not seal it, and she did not send it. The rest of the day passed in careful rituals. Clara's reading lesson, embroidery on the veranda, tea with Miss Winifred, whose gaze had grown increasingly sharp since the garden party. Kate moved through it all with practiced elegance, her face calm, her voice steady, her thoughts elsewhere, always returning to the letter waiting in silence upstairs. As twilight descended, a soft knock echoed from the front door. It was early evening, and few visitors came unannounced at that hour. Kate was reading aloud to Clara in the drawing room when the butler appeared, his expression neutral but curious. "Mr. Henry Caldwell, miss," he said, as though repeating something he could not quite believe. "He wishes to speak with you." Kate's breath caught. Clara sat up, wide-eyed. "He's here again?" Kate set the book aside with careful fingers. "Stay here, darling." She followed the butler into the front parlour, her pulse a tight rhythm beneath her skin. Henry stood near the fireplace, his coat damp from the moisture in the air, his hair slightly tousled, as if the wind had combed it without permission. He looked as he always did, composed, severe, yet shadowed by something tender that refused to be buried. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "to what do we owe this unexpected visit?" He did not smile. His eyes, steady and searching, held hers. "I came to speak with you, about Clara and about other matters." She nodded once, silent. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I wrote to you. Twice. Then I tore both letters apart. I thought, perhaps, you preferred silence. But silence, Miss Ellsworth, has become unbearable." She looked away, her fingers trembling against the folds of her gown. "You were distant at the garden party," he continued, "and I understand the reason. But I must ask, have I done something to offend you?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. His voice gentled. "Then why do you run from me when your eyes do not?" Her breath hitched. "Because I am afraid." He stepped closer still. "Of me, of everything," she whispered. "Of what they will say, of losing my place, of believing in something I have no right to claim." His silence was deep and long. Then softly, "You think you have no right to be looked at as I look at you." She met his gaze then, and in it she found no judgment, no pretense, only a kind of reverence that made her heart ache. "I am a governess, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice breaking. "I own nothing, I owe everything, and a man like you—" He interrupted her gently. "Do not tell me what I am, let me tell you what I see." She did not move. "I see a woman who speaks with dignity and listens with patience, a woman who carries herself like a duchess but has no title, a woman whose words linger long after she has left the room. That is what I see." Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. He reached for her hand, slowly, as if giving her time to withdraw. She did not. Their fingers met. The contact was brief, barely more than a touch, but it was enough to set the air between them alight. "Kate," he said her name with a reverence that undid her. Her lips parted, but no words came. A faint rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, soft and low. She withdrew her hand, gently but firmly, and stepped back. "I cannot," she whispered. "Not yet." He nodded, understanding more in her silence than in her speech. "Then I will wait." She turned away before he could see the conflict written across her face. He left without asking for anything more. That night, a lightning storm flared far out over the sea, silent from the distance but visible from the bedroom window. Kate stood before the glass, the curtains pulled wide, her nightgown billowing in the breeze. She held the letter in her hand, still unsealed. She opened the window, letting the salt air rush in. And then, with a breath caught between sorrow and resolve, she placed the letter gently between the pages of the green leather book. She did not destroy it, but she did not send it. Instead, she stood there, her hand resting on the windowsill, eyes fixed on the horizon where the storm danced in the distance. She wondered if Henry could see it from his home, if he too stood at a window watching the same lightning flicker across the night. And she wondered, quietly, painfully, if silence, once again, would be the only answer. The Langstons returned from New York on a Tuesday afternoon, escorted by trunks, maids, and the scent of expensive perfume. Their arrival stirred the rhythm of the house with swift precision, like the strike of a conductor's baton. Rooms were aired, shoes polished, and every surface dusted until it shone. For most of the staff, it was simply the return of order. For Kate Ellsworth, it was the return of scrutiny. She stood at the top of the staircase as the carriages rolled into the gravel drive. Clara pressed to her side, waving with unfiltered joy. Mrs. Langston descended from the first carriage with her usual elegance, her gloved hand barely touching the footman's arm. She was dressed in travelling silks of ivory and lilac, her hat wide-brimmed and adorned with a single white plume. Her smile for her daughter was faint but sincere. Kate curtsied, her posture flawless, though her stomach had twisted into a knot. "Miss Ellsworth," Mrs. Langston said, eyes sweeping over her. "You look well." "Thank you, madam." "Has Clara remained obedient?" "She has, madam. Exceptionally so." Mrs. Langston nodded, but her eyes lingered a moment too long. Something unspoken hovered in the air, a tension Kate felt in her bones. It was not the stare of curiosity. It was the stare of accusation already decided. That evening, after supper, the summons came. The butler informed Kate that Mrs. Langston wished to speak with her privately in the solarium. Kate followed with quiet dignity, her footsteps light, her heart heavy. The solarium was filled with twilight and the soft rustle of plants. Mrs. Langston stood by a tall urn of white orchids, her silhouette framed by glass walls. "You have served this household with consistency," she began, her tone clipped and polished, "and with a certain decorum that I have, until now, appreciated." Kate inclined her head. "I have always sought to uphold the values of the household." Mrs. Langston turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "And yet, decorum seems to be failing you. Or perhaps you have simply grown bold beneath our roof." "I do not understand, madam." Mrs. Langston's voice lowered, its edge unmistakable. "You know precisely what I mean. I returned to whispers of carriages seen at odd hours, of visits from a man who does not visit, of attentions from Henry Caldwell that have become visible." Kate's breath caught. "Mr. Caldwell's visits have been respectful. They were prompted by Clara. So you deny cultivating his interest?" Kate's voice trembled, but she held firm. "I have not sought it." Mrs. Langston studied her for a long moment, the silence between them as sharp as broken glass. Then with a sigh, she stepped back. "I cannot dismiss you, not without proof. But you must understand, your conduct reflects upon this house. As such, I am placing you under observation. Probation, if you will. Should any further incident arise, your position will no longer be tenable." Kate stood frozen. "You believe I have compromised myself." "I believe," Mrs. Langston said coldly, "that you have forgotten your place." The words stung more deeply than she expected. She nodded once, her dignity intact, though inside something crumbled. That night she wept silently into her pillow, alone in her room, with the green leather book unopened on the nightstand. The following day, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The servants, though courteous, became more cautious around her. Miss Winifred's glances grew sharper, and Miss Thornbridge passed her in the hallway with a knowing look, her chin slightly raised. It was nearly noon when the butler came again. "Mr. Caldwell requests a moment of your time, miss." Kate was in the schoolroom, reviewing Clara's handwriting. Her heart stuttered. She found him in the library, standing by the tall window that overlooked the garden. He turned as she entered, his expression tense. "You look pale," he said. "You should not be here. They humiliated you." She stiffened. "Who told you?" "I have ears in Newport," he replied, then added more softly, "and eyes." Kate took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "Your presence only fuels the rumors, Henry. And what if I no longer care about rumors?" She looked away. "I do." His steps brought him closer. "Then allow me to remove you from them. Come to Caldwell House, not as a guest, not as a distraction. Come as Clara's tutor, as part of my household. You would live with dignity, with safety." The offer struck her like thunder. She turned slowly to face him. "You cannot ask me that." "I can," he said, "and I have." Her voice cracked. "Do you know what it would mean for me, for a woman in my position, to leave this house for yours, unmarried, unprotected? You would be protected by my name, but not by law," she said, "and that is all society sees." Henry's eyes darkened. "So let them choke on their rules. I will not apologize for wanting your presence in my home." She shook her head, trembling. "You don't understand. I already walk a tightrope. If I fall, there is no net beneath me, only disgrace." He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. His fingers were warm, grounding. "Then tell me what you need, Kate." She looked up at him, tears burning behind her eyes. "I need to be seen, and not destroyed for it." He cupped her hand between both of his. "Then I will find a way to see you fully and shield you at once." Her heart cracked wide open in silence, but she said nothing more. That evening, as Kate sat alone with her thoughts, a new name began to circulate on every tongue in Newport: Lady Penelope Astor. She had arrived from Boston with trunks of lace and ambition. A widow of considerable fortune and impeccable lineage, she was no stranger to power and no stranger to Henry Caldwell. Within 2 days, she was seen walking beside him at the Cliff Walk. Within 3, she was seated beside him at a dinner hosted by the Whitmores. By the end of the week, the newspapers printed their first quiet speculation, whispers of an engagement. Kate read the headline in silence, her tea untouched, her heart clenched, not from jealousy, but from inevitability. She was no match for a woman like Lady Astor, and still, when she looked out her window and saw the storm building once again above the sea, she could not bring herself to close the shutters, because part of her still waited, still hoped. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The night of the masquerade arrived dressed in silk and secrecy. Lanterns flickered like floating stars above the grand gardens of the Whitmore estate, casting golden light over marble fountains and ivy-covered archways. A string quartet played beneath a sculpted arbor, the music spilling across the velvet night like perfume. Beneath the chandeliered terraces, society's most glittering names moved behind feathers and lace, every gesture deliberate, every smile laced with hidden meaning. Newport had waited for this night for weeks. Kate Ellsworth had planned to remain at home. She had prepared Clara's gown herself, a ruffled confection of soft yellow with pearl buttons and white gloves. The child had begged her to come along, pleaded with the sweet tenacity that only children possess. "You promised you would be there," Clara said as she clung to Kate's arm, "just for a little while, just until the dancing begins." It was not an invitation, but a plea. And so, as dusk fell over the Langston estate, Kate allowed the housemaid to help her dress in a borrowed gown, one of Miss Winifred's from several seasons past. Pale blue silk with a modest neckline, its once fine details slightly faded but still elegant under candlelight. Her gloves were linen, her shoes too tight. Her mask was simple, a half mask of ivory trimmed in silver thread, no feathers, no sparkle, just enough to conceal. She arrived quietly, entering through the servants' corridor with the other companions and chaperones. She stood at the edge of the grand hall, near a vase of white lilies, careful to blend into the walls, but nothing could conceal the quickening of her breath as she took in the room, the opulence, the music, the rising tension she could feel in her chest before even seeing him. Henry was there. She sensed him before her eyes found him. When she did, her heart stopped. He stood beneath the grand arch at the opposite end of the ballroom, his tall frame wrapped in a dark tailcoat, a simple black mask covering the upper half of his face. A silver cravat adorned his neck, and his hair, swept back with elegant control, revealed the sharp line of his jaw. At his side stood Lady Penelope Astor. Her gown shimmered like starlight, silver and white, with a high collar of French lace and a peacock-feathered mask that exaggerated the haughtiness of her gaze. Her gloved hand rested lightly on Henry's arm, her posture that of possession. Her laugh was low and deliberate, meant to be noticed, but Henry's eyes searched the room. He was looking for someone. Kate turned her face slightly, as if pretending to admire the drapery. The orchestra began a waltz. The room spun into life, skirts twirling, jewels glittering, fans fluttering in nervous hands. And then he saw her. Henry's gaze locked with hers across the ballroom, and the world seemed to hush. He stepped away from Lady Astor. Kate's breath caught as he crossed the room, slow but steady, weaving through dancers as if he had been summoned by something stronger than etiquette. He reached her in silence. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low behind the mask. "I am not meant to be seen on this floor," she replied, not quite looking at him. He extended his gloved hand. "Then let us be seen, only once." She hesitated. Then slowly she placed her hand in his. Their fingers barely touched. But in that touch was everything they had not said. They moved to the center of the ballroom. All around them, dancers flowed like water, but the music narrowed between them, every note pulling them closer. Their hands were properly placed, her gloved hand on his shoulder, his at her waist. But the space between them pulsed with tension. Their eyes met once, twice. Neither spoke. Their steps were measured, graceful, aching. He leaned in slightly. "I did not expect you to come. I almost didn't. I'm glad you did." She lowered her gaze. "This is dangerous. Everything worth feeling is." Her breath trembled. "They're watching. Let them." Their bodies moved in perfect rhythm, though neither had practiced. It was a dance born of understanding, of silence, of glances across crowded rooms and words never spoken aloud. When the music ended, he bowed. She curtsied. Neither said goodbye. She returned to the edges of the room, to the lilies, to the safety of shadow. Moments later, Lady Penelope approached. Kate saw her coming, like a storm in satin. "Miss Ellsworth," she said, her voice honeyed and sharp. "Or shall I say, the belle of the evening." Kate remained composed. "Lady Astor." Penelope's eyes glinted behind her feathers. "You dance beautifully, quite unexpected. I had not imagined a governess might be trained in such elegance. I was taught when I was young. Before circumstances changed." "How noble of you," Penelope replied, voice laced with venom. "And how dangerous. You walk a very fine line." Kate held her chin high. "I do not seek anyone's attention." "Oh, but you've had it," Lady Astor said, stepping closer. "And now the entire ballroom knows it. Do you truly believe you can pass among us unnoticed? That a man like Henry Caldwell can look at you like that without consequences?" Kate's throat tightened. "I don't wish for consequence, only peace." "Then disappear," Penelope whispered, "before the whisper becomes a roar." She swept away with a swirl of skirts, her meaning clear. The rest of the night passed like a dream Kate did not wish to revisit. She left before midnight, her mask tucked into her gloved hand, her breath caught between shame and defiance. She walked home under a moonless sky, but the stars saw everything, and so did the shadows. The morning broke under a shroud of grey mist that rolled in from the sea, settling over the rooftops of Newport like a silent omen. The servants whispered that a storm was coming. The wind, restless and sharp, carried the scent of rain and gossip, two things that spread too easily in a town built on appearances. Kate Ellsworth felt it before she heard it. The tension, the glances, the abrupt silences when she entered a room. Something had shifted in the air of the Langston residence. Even Clara's laughter seemed thinner that morning, her usually bright eyes troubled by a shadow she could not name. By mid-afternoon, the housemaid, pale and hesitant, entered the schoolroom holding a folded newspaper and a look of pity. "Miss Ellsworth," she murmured, "you should see this." Kate took the paper, puzzled. It was not the headlines that caught her eye, but the smaller column on the second page, a section devoted to social murmurs and private scandals. Her hands froze as her eyes caught her own name. It was written with venom disguised as civility. A certain governess of refined demeanor and humble origin has been seen engaging in more than educational endeavors with one of Newport's most respected tycoons. Sources close to both households confirm that an exchange of letters of an intimate nature has recently come to light. The room blurred for a moment. She read it again, as if disbelief might change the words. But there it was. The malicious invention of someone determined to destroy her. She folded the paper carefully, her voice steady even as her heart thundered. "Thank you, Nora. You may go." The maid curtsied, relief softening her expression. When the door closed, Kate pressed her palms to the table. She felt the weight of humiliation and fear, the fear not for herself, but for Clara, for what this would mean for the child's place in society, for Henry, for the fragile respectability she had guarded with such care. By evening, whispers had reached the Langstons. Miss Winifred entered the drawing room, her composure like a blade. "Mrs. Langston wishes to speak with you," she said curtly. Kate followed her, her steps echoing down the marble corridor. Mrs. Langston sat near the window holding the same newspaper. She did not rise. "So," she said, her tone like frost, "it seems your name has become conversation." Kate's voice wavered but did not break. "The article is false." Mrs. Langston looked up sharply. "False or not, it is printed, and the damage is done. You have shamed this house, Miss Ellsworth. My daughter's governess consorting with a man of Henry Caldwell's stature. It is unthinkable." Kate's hands clenched. "There has been no impropriety. Mr. Caldwell has behaved with nothing but respect." Respect. Mrs. Langston rose, her eyes flashing. "Do you take me for a fool? Everyone in this town has seen the way he looks at you. Even Lady Penelope Astor has remarked upon it. And now this." She gestured to the paper. "Tell me, Miss Ellsworth, did you write to him?" The question struck like a slap. Kate's breath caught. She thought of the letter she had written and never sent. A letter that had lain hidden between the pages of the green leather book. Her silence betrayed her. Mrs. Langston's eyes narrowed. "I see. Your refusal to deny it speaks louder than words. You will not be dismissed tonight, but you will confine yourself to your rooms until further notice. I will decide your future in the morning." Kate curtsied faintly, unable to speak. That night, the storm finally broke. Rain slashed against the windows. The sea roared beyond the cliffs, and thunder rolled across the horizon. The servants hurried to secure the shutters, their voices a nervous hum in the hall. Kate sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the lamp's small, trembling flame. She thought of Henry, where he was, what he had read, what he might think. Did he believe the rumors? Did he doubt her silence now? The ache in her chest deepened until it felt unbearable. A knock at her door startled her. It was Clara, barefoot, pale, her small hands shaking. "Miss Kate," she whispered, they said you're leaving, that you did something wrong." Kate knelt and took the child's face in her hands. "No, my darling, you mustn't listen to them." "But it's in the paper," Clara cried, her voice breaking. "They said you made Mr. Caldwell love you so you could be rich." Kate's heart shattered at the words. "No," she said softly, pulling Clara into her arms. "No, none of that is true. I promise you, but sometimes people say cruel things when they don't understand the truth." Clara's tears soaked her sleeve. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" Kate hesitated. "I hope so." But the hesitation was enough. The child pulled away, eyes wide with sudden, desperate fear. Later, as the wind howled and rain hammered the glass, a commotion rose from the servants' quarters. Doors slammed, voices shouted, "Clara!" someone cried. "The child! She's gone!" Kate ran from her room without shoes, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Where?" "The cliffs," one of the maids stammered. "She must have gone out the back gate. We found her cloak missing." Kate didn't wait for more. She gathered her skirts and ran into the storm. Rain blinded her. The wind tore at her gown as she stumbled across the garden and onto the narrow path leading toward the sea. Lightning split the sky, revealing flashes of white foam far below the cliff's edge. "Clara!" she shouted, her voice breaking against the roar of the waves. "Clara!" From behind her came the pounding of hooves. A horse stopped, and Henry dismounted, his coat soaked through, his face pale with alarm. "Kate!" he called. "They told me. Where is she?" "She's out here somewhere," Kate cried. "She was frightened. She ran because of me." They searched together, calling her name, their voices swallowed by the wind. Kate's shoes slipped on the wet earth, and Henry caught her arm, steadying her. Their eyes met for only a second, raw, breathless, desperate. Then, through the curtain of rain, they saw her. Clara stood near the edge of the cliff, her small figure trembling, her white cloak billowing like a ghost. Kate ran first, the mud pulling at her skirts. "Clara, come back!" The child turned, her face streaked with rain and tears. "You're not going to leave me, are you?" Kate fell to her knees and opened her arms. "Never, my darling. Come here, please." Clara took a step forward, then another. Her small hands found Kate's, and in that instant, the storm seemed to ease its breath. Henry reached them, wrapping his coat around the child and lifting her into his arms. He held her close as they turned back toward the house, Kate following, drenched and trembling. By the time they reached the foyer, servants were waiting with blankets. Clara was carried upstairs, safe but sobbing. Kate stood motionless, water dripping from her hair, her body numb with relief and exhaustion. Henry approached her. His voice was low, roughened by the wind. "This is my fault. I should have spoken sooner. I should have stopped this before it began." She shook her head. "You couldn't have known." "I will not let them destroy you," he said fiercely. "Tomorrow night, the Langstons dine with the Whitmores. Every family that matters will be there. So will I. I'll end this publicly, before them all." Her lips parted, but she could find no words. The next evening, the grand dining hall of the Whitmore estate glittered under crystal chandeliers. The room was heavy with perfume and hypocrisy. Lady Penelope Astor sat near the head of the table, her diamonds gleaming like small daggers. Mrs. Langston and Miss Winifred whispered behind their fans. When Henry Caldwell entered, the conversation stopped. He stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing in the silence, "I am told that my name has been printed in scandal sheets alongside that of Miss Kate Ellsworth." A murmur rippled through the guests. He continued, unflinching. "Allow me to make this perfectly clear. Miss Ellsworth is guilty of nothing but integrity and grace. Any who speak against her speak against me. The false letter circulating was written not by her hand, but by another's jealousy, one who sought to wound us both." His gaze flicked briefly toward Miss Thornbridge, who sat frozen, her fan trembling in her hand. Her eyes dropped, guilt etched in every line of her face. The crowd shifted, shame spreading like fire through their silks and whispers. Henry's voice softened. "Miss Ellsworth's honor remains unblemished, and I will thank this company to remember that." He bowed and left the room. Kate, who had been standing near the entrance unseen, felt tears rise. Not from humiliation, but from something far deeper. He had done what few men would ever dare. He had defied them all for her. And yet she knew what she must do. Later that night, while the storm outside calmed into a quiet drizzle, Kate packed her few belongings. Clara slept peacefully upstairs, unaware. Before dawn, Kate left the Langston mansion. The streets were wet and glistening, the air cool with the scent of the sea. She paused once at the gate and looked back, her heart aching with both gratitude and sorrow. She whispered a silent farewell, to Clara, to the house, to the man whose kindness had both saved and doomed her. Then she walked away into the grey morning, the sound of the receding tide following her like the echo of a love she could not claim. The first chill of October crept through Boston like a soft, uninvited guest. The leaves along Beacon Street had begun to turn, blazing with colour before surrendering to the cobblestones below. In the mornings, the fog rolled in from the harbour, coating the city in a pale silver veil that blurred the outlines of its rooftops and church spires. Kate Ellsworth walked each day through that mist, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her steps measured and unhurried. It had been 6 weeks since she had left Newport. 6 weeks since the grey dawn, when she had closed the Langstons' gate behind her without a word of farewell. In those weeks, life had resumed, quiet, predictable, unremarkable. She had found a position at a private girls' school on Marlborough Street, where her students were polite and studious, and the other teachers kind but distant. Her room overlooked the narrow courtyard behind the chapel, where she often sat in the evenings, reading by lamplight as the city sighed beyond the window panes. She told herself she was content. She told herself she had made peace with the past. But at times, when she lifted her eyes from the page, she found herself listening for the sound of the sea that was no longer there, for a voice that had become part of her silence. It was on one such morning, grey and restless, that everything changed. The sky threatened rain, the courtyard glistened faintly from the night's drizzle. The bell had just rung, sending the girls in white pinafores scattering to their lessons. Kate remained near the iron gate that separated the school from the street, her hands tucked inside her gloves, her breath visible in the cold air. Then she saw him. At first, she thought her imagination had conjured him again, as it had done so often in the lonely hours before sleep. But the figure did not vanish when she blinked. He was there, solid and real, standing by the gate as though he had been waiting for years instead of moments. Henry Caldwell. He wore a dark overcoat that reached his knees, and his hair was damp with the mist. In his hands, gloved against the cold, he held something small and familiar, a green leather book. For a long, suspended second, neither spoke. Then he lifted the latch and stepped into the courtyard. "You make it impossible to forget you, Miss Ellsworth," he said softly. His voice carried the same restrained warmth she remembered, deeper now, weighted with things unsaid. Kate's heart pounded, but her words, when they came, were steady. "You shouldn't have come." "Perhaps not," he admitted. "And yet I did." He approached her slowly, careful not to startle the fragile calm between them. When he stopped a few feet away, he looked down at the book in his hand. "I believe this belongs to you, or perhaps it always belonged to both of us." Her gaze fell on the volume. "The poetry book," she whispered. He opened it, revealing a single folded page tucked inside. "I found it weeks ago, hidden between the last pages. Your letter." The colour drained from her face. "You read it?" "I did." His tone was quiet, reverent. "Every word." Kate lowered her eyes. "It was never meant to be sent." "Then allow me to answer it in person." The wind rustled the ivy along the wall, scattering droplets onto the cobblestones. Kate stood motionless, unable to flee and unwilling to hope. Henry's gaze held hers with an intensity that undid her composure. "When you left Newport, you took the air from that place. Every room, every hall, every garden felt emptier than before. I thought I could endure it. That distance would make sense of what I felt. But instead, it made everything clearer." She shook her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say this." "I do," he said, taking a step closer. "I loved you, Kate. Not despite your station, as some cruel society might phrase it, but because of who you are, because of your strength, your kindness, your maddening honesty. You came into my life when I had long since ceased believing in grace, and you taught me to breathe again." Her throat tightened. "Henry, please!" He stopped as though reading the turmoil in her eyes. "You once told me you feared the silence between us. I have lived in that silence since you left, and I cannot bear it any longer. I came to ask you to end it." Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. "I don't care about scandal," he continued. "Let Newport whisper. Let the world misjudge. I would rather spend one day beside you in truth than a lifetime among those who mistake propriety for honor." A tear slipped down her cheek. "You don't know what you're asking." "Yes, I do," he said gently. "I'm asking for a chance to make you happy, to give you peace, to bring you home. Home." The word struck deep. For the first time in months, Kate felt warmth bloom through the chill. She looked up at him, the man who had once been so untouchable, now standing before her like a supplicant before the altar of everything he had denied himself. She took a step forward. "And what if they never forgive us? What if the world never forgets?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and hope. "Then let the world be damned." Something in her broke then, not in despair, but in surrender. The kind of surrender born not of weakness, but of trust. She reached out, her gloved hand trembling, and he took it with a tenderness that steadied them both. The rain began softly, a whisper on the rooftops. In that grey courtyard, under the hush of falling mist, he leaned closer and said quietly, "Come back to me." Her voice was barely audible. "Yes." Later that afternoon, they travelled together by train, the rain streaking the windows as the city receded into blur. Neither spoke much. Words had already been spent between them. When she glanced his way, she found him watching her, not possessively, but with quiet awe, as if still unable to believe she was real. By the time the train reached Rhode Island, dusk had settled. The sky glowed with that faint, silvered light that appears only after rain. As the carriage rolled through the gates of Caldwell House, Kate felt a strange calm descend upon her. The ivy-clad walls no longer loomed as they had that first stormy night. They seemed gentler now, touched by time and memory. Henry helped her down from the carriage. The lamps inside glowed warmly against the growing dark. When she stepped into the grand hall, the scent of pine and old books filled her senses. A fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing across the polished floor. It felt both familiar and new, like stepping into a memory that had been waiting for her to return. Henry removed his coat and turned toward her. "This house was never alive until you crossed its threshold," he said softly. "It was only walls and ghosts before." Kate smiled faintly. "And now?" "Now it's home," he replied. She did not answer with words. She looked around, the same room where their silence had once spoken louder than speech, and then back to him. Her eyes told him everything. Weeks passed. The leaves fell and the air grew colder, but inside the house warmth reigned. The fire in the drawing room burned almost constantly, and the sea beyond the cliffs sang softly against the rocks. One afternoon, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, Kate sat by the hearth, her embroidery resting in her lap. Henry read beside her, his spectacles sliding slightly down his nose. Their quiet was the comfortable kind, the kind that had once seemed impossible. In the garden below, Clara played beneath the autumn drizzle, her laughter rising faintly through the glass. The sight of her, a child restored to innocence, brought a soft smile to Kate's face. Henry looked up from his book. "You're thinking again," he murmured. "Always," she replied. "About what?" She turned to him, her eyes gentle, luminous. "About how storms end, how they change what they touch, but never destroy what's meant to remain." He reached for her hand. "Some storms," he said quietly, "bring us home." Outside, the rain fell in steady rhythm against the glass, echoing the very first night they had met. The same music, the same unspoken promise. And as the firelight flickered across their faces, the storm that had once threatened to tear their worlds apart became nothing more than a distant memory, transformed at last into peace. Beneath that soft stormlight, the woman who had entered his life as a shadow now sat beside him as his light. The governess, who had once stood in the rain, uncertain and alone, was now the mistress of the house. And in the quiet that followed, they both understood what the world never could, that love, once born of truth, endures every tempest and finds its calm at last. The wind that swept through Newport that October carried with it the scent of sea salt and fallen leaves, familiar, timeless, and tinged with the ache of memory. The once glittering resort town had grown quieter with the years. The laughter of grand galas had softened into the rustle of ivy climbing older walls, yet in the heart of Bellevue Avenue, one mansion remained filled with life, not of opulence, but of something far rarer. Caldwell House. Inside, the drawing room was much the same. The ornate fireplace still held the same carved details of lions and roses, and the same grandfather clock still marked each hour with patient dignity. But now, framed sketches of children's hands adorned the sideboard. A doll's bonnet rested forgotten on a velvet armchair. A dog, aging, gentle, dozed at the foot of the settee, and near the window, bathed in late afternoon light, Kate Caldwell sat stitching a small garment in quiet concentration. Her auburn hair was now streaked with silver at the temples, and fine lines traced the corners of her eyes. But her gaze had not dimmed. It was steadier, wiser. From time to time she paused, listening. Footsteps approached. Light, hurried, unmistakably young. "Mama!" A boy of 6 burst into the room, cheeks flushed, dark curls tumbling over his brow. He held a worn book in one hand and an urgent question in the other. "Papa says I may read the poem aloud tonight if I practice again. Will you help me now?" Kate smiled and set her needlework aside. "Of course, Thomas. Come sit here beside me." The child climbed onto the settee, his small voice already stumbling over the lines of Longfellow. As he read, Kate looked past him toward the garden, where her daughter, Emily, now 4, played beneath the same oak trees where Clara once wandered. Clara, now 15, was taller, more thoughtful, and fiercely protective of her younger siblings. She had become the heart of the household, as much a sister as a daughter, her resilience a quiet tribute to the woman who had once found her on the edge of the cliffs. From the hallway, Henry appeared, slower than before, with a touch of white at his temples, but still the same in every essential way. His eyes met Kate's with a warmth that had only deepened with time. They had married one winter after that October return, without grand announcements or society columns, just a small ceremony in Boston, surrounded by a few friends who had loved them without condition. The scandal had lingered in whispers for a while, but society as always moved on, to newer gossip, younger scandals. And those who had tried to ruin them, some had faded into irrelevance. Others, like Lady Penelope Astor, remained trapped in their endless pursuit of position, never quite understanding the power of love that required no ballroom approval. Mrs. Langston had never spoken to Kate again, but it was her husband who, years later, wrote a quiet letter of apology, never mailed, but found among his papers after his passing. As for Newport, the changes had come slowly but inevitably. The season was no longer the empire it once was. Younger generations questioned more, bowed less. A new world was taking shape, one that Kate and Henry welcomed, even if cautiously. At night, they still read poetry together by the fire. Sometimes the verses were familiar, and sometimes new. But they always ended with silence, the kind they had once feared, now transformed into comfort. Outside, the garden rustled in gold and amber. The air was crisp, filled with distant laughter and the promise of another storm on the horizon. But inside, there was only warmth, a hearth that never faded, a family that had been born not from wealth or ambition, but from the ashes of sorrow and the courage of truth. As twilight settled over the mansion, Kate stood and watched her children, her heart full, her hands weathered, her soul quiet. She had once thought love was fleeting. Now she knew better. Love, Real love endures through scandal, through silence, through storms and years and memory. It builds its home not in the eyes of the world, but in the hearts of those who choose it, every day, without apology, without regret. And beneath the stormlight, still glowing in her heart, Kate Caldwell knew she had chosen well. What if the storm you once feared was the very thing that washed away everything false and revealed what truly mattered? Kate's journey reminds us that love does not always arrive wrapped in perfection or approval. Sometimes it walks in quietly during the rain, when we least expect it. This story is a tribute to every woman who's ever been told she didn't belong, every heart that's been silenced by class or fear, and every soul brave enough to choose love anyway. Through whispers and warnings, through loss and longing, Kate and Henry found not just each other, but a home built on truth, courage, and second chances. And in a world still obsessed with appearances, their story is a gentle reminder. Grace is greater than gossip, and love is stronger than shame. If you made it to the end, type the word Stormlight in the comments, so we'll know you walked this emotional road with us. It means the world to see who felt every heartbeat in this tale. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes in love that endures, despite everything. And don't leave just yet. We've left more historical romances just like this one in the video cards and on our channel. Let yourself fall in love again and again. Thank you for being part of this beautiful journey.